The whole town of Caldwell Flats heard her say it. Delia Harmon stood in the center of Main Street on a Thursday morning in late September of 1882, her travel trunk dragging a groove in the dust behind her jaw set so tight the muscles in her cheeks trembled. She had not announced it quietly. She had not whispered it into a neighbor's ear over a fence post. She had said it out loud, to anyone within earshot, which in a town of 400 souls on the Kansas-Oklahoma border meant that within 3 minutes, everyone knew. "I am leaving Caldwell Flats," she said, loud enough to carry past the general store, past the barber, past the widow Crowley sweeping her front step. "I am done with this place, and I am done with everyone in it." The crowd that had gathered on both sides of the street went very still. Men with coffee cups in their hands, women in aprons. The schoolteacher, who had come out of the schoolhouse at the sound of raised voices. 2 cowboys leaning against the post of the saloon who suddenly forgot their cigarettes, and then the door of the sheriff's office swung open. Vincent Irons stepped out onto the boardwalk, one hand resting on the door frame, the other hanging loose at his side. He was 32 years old, with dark hair cut short and gray eyes that had a way of landing on a person like they intended to stay. His badge caught the morning light. He looked at Delia Harmon with her trunk and her fury and her jaw like a set trap, and something moved across his face that was not quite an emotion most men would admit to in public. Then he spoke. "Over my watch," he said, not shouting, not threatening. Just those 3 words, quiet and absolute, dropped into the silence of Main Street like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going out in every direction before anyone could stop them. Delia turned and looked at him. The whole town turned and looked at him. For a moment nobody breathed. Then Delia Harmon let go of her trunk, turned fully to face the sheriff and said, "Excuse me." And that was the moment that everything changed. Not just for the 2 of them, but for Caldwell Flats itself. For the dark secret that had been festering at the town's core for 3 years. For the man who had put it there. And for every hidden motive and buried betrayal that was about to come clawing its way up into the September sun where everyone could finally see it. But to understand what those 3 words meant, and why they hit Delia Harmon like a hand pressed flat against her chest, you had to know where she had come from. You had to know what the town had done to her. And you had to know what Vincent Irons had been carrying in silence for the better part of 2 years. It had started in the autumn of 1879. Delia Harmon had arrived in Caldwell Flats on the back of a wagon driven by her uncle, a stubborn and largely useless man named Gerald Harmon, who had decided that the Kansas frontier was the place to make his fortune. Gerald had a gift for deciding things and a corresponding absence of follow-through. And within 6 months of arriving in Caldwell Flats, he had managed to lose his stake in a cattle deal, fall into debt with the town's most influential man, and drink himself into a condition that made him unemployable. He had then done the one truly useful thing of his adult life, which was to die of pneumonia in February of 1880, leaving Delia, who was 24 years old, the small house he had been renting on the edge of town, and a debt she knew nothing about. Delia was not a woman who had been designed for helplessness. She had grown up in Missouri with a mother who sewed and a father who taught school, and she had inherited a sharp intelligence from both of them along with a stubbornness that her mother called willfulness and her father called character. She could read and write with facility. She could sew well enough to make it a trade. She could bake, keep accounts, stretch a dollar until it was nearly transparent, and argue a point with a precision that made men uncomfortable, because they were not accustomed to being logically defeated by a woman in a calico dress. She had started a small sewing business within a month of her uncle's death. She had taken in alterations and made dresses for the women of the town, and eventually had enough work coming through her door that she hired a girl named Pauline to help her. She had made a life, not a grand one, not a romantic one, but a life that was hers, built out of her own labor and her own decisions, and she had been quietly proud of it. And then Harlan Briggs had come to collect. Harlan Briggs was what Caldwell Flats called its most prominent citizen, and what a more honest accounting would have called its hidden ruler. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, the two biggest buildings on Main Street, the feed store, and a significant piece of the bank. He was 51 years old, heavy-jowled, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades getting what he wanted and had forgotten that wanting something was not the same as being entitled to it. He had known Gerald Harmon. He had lent Gerald Harmon money at terms Gerald had not read carefully, and those terms had included the house. He came to see Delia on a Tuesday in April of 1880. He sat in her front room and he laid the papers on her table, and he told her that the house she was living in belonged to him and that she had two options. She could vacate within 30 days, or she could make an arrangement with him. He was not crude about it. That was the thing that made Delia's skin crawl in retrospect. He was almost courteous. The arrangement he proposed was marriage, framed as generosity, as rescue, as an opportunity a woman in her position ought to be grateful for. He was a widower. He needed a wife. She needed a home and security. It was simple mathematics, he said, and he smiled when he said it, and the smile was the worst part. Delia had said no. She had said it clearly, with no hedging, and she had asked him to leave her house. He had stood up, tucked the papers back into his jacket, and told her that she had 30 days to reconsider, and that he hoped she would be reasonable. She had not been reasonable. She had, within those 30 days, found new accommodations above the dress shop she was renting on Front Street, had moved her things and her business there, and had written Harlan Briggs a letter informing him that she would have no further communications with him on any subject. What she had not accounted for was the depth of Harlan Briggs's capacity for a particular kind of sustained, methodical revenge that never showed its face directly. Over the next 2 years, business dried up, not all at once. Slowly, in a way that could always be attributed to other things, to the drought of 1880, to women preferring to order ready-made goods from the catalog, to nothing in particular. But Delia was smart enough to notice that the drying up had a pattern. The women who stopped coming to her were the wives of men who did business with Harlan Briggs. The orders that fell through were from households connected to Briggs's network. She could not prove it. She could not stand in front of anyone and say, "This man is punishing me." All she had was her own shrinking income, and the looks she got from certain women in town. Looks that contained a kind of pitying, helpless apology. The one person who had been consistently kind to her was the school teacher, a woman named Agnes Foyle, who had no connection to Briggs's world and who treated Delia as an intelligent equal and brought her alterations work every season without fail. And it had been Agnes who, one evening over tea, had said very carefully that she thought Delia ought to know that she had heard Harlan Briggs tell someone at a dinner party that Delia Harmon was trouble, and that anyone who valued their standing in Caldwell Flats would do well to keep a distance. That was 2 weeks before September. That was 2 weeks before the trunk on Main Street and the words "over my watch." In those 2 weeks, Delia had made her decision. She had written to a cousin in Denver who had offered, years ago, a standing invitation. She had counted her savings and found them meager but sufficient for a train ticket and a modest start. She had packed her belongings with the particular efficiency of someone who is not looking back. She had decided that Caldwell Flats had taken enough from her. and that she would give it nothing more. She had not, in making this decision, considered Vincent Irons. She had not, if she were honest, thought much about Vincent Irons at all, beyond the basic fact of his existence and his function, which was to be the sheriff of the town in which she lived. She knew him in the peripheral way that everyone knew the sheriff. She knew he had arrived in Caldwell Flats in 1880, that he had been appointed to the position after the previous sheriff had retired, that he was from somewhere in Texas, that he was quiet and capable and fair-minded in the way that made people trust him without particularly thinking about him. She knew he had never been rude to her, which in a frontier town was not nothing. She knew he sometimes came into the dress shop to ask if she had a button he could replace on a coat, and that he always paid for it, and that he always said thank you and meant it. She did not know that he had been watching Harlan Briggs for 2 years. She did not know that he had a file in his desk drawer that was 4 inches thick with careful, documented observations of Briggs's operations, that he had been in contact with a federal marshal in Wichita, that he had been building a case with the patient, methodical attention of a man who understood that acting too soon would mean acting wrong, and that acting wrong would mean Briggs walked free. She did not know any of that, and so when she dragged her trunk down Main Street and announced to the town that she was leaving, she had no idea that her departure would collapse everything Vincent Irons had been building for 2 years. Because Delia Harmon, entirely without knowing it, was the key. Vincent had understood this for 11 months. The document that would tie Harlan Briggs to a land fraud operation that stretched across 4 counties, that had cheated at least 30 families out of their homestead claims, that had lined Briggs's pockets with money that should have built schools and granaries and futures. That document existed in 1 copy. The man who had written it, a surveyor named Carver who had worked for Briggs before his conscience had caught up with him, had given it to someone for safekeeping before he had left the territory. He had given it to Gerald Harmon, because Gerald Harmon had been the only person in Caldwell Flats who had both a grudge against Briggs and a house with a good hiding place. Gerald Harmon was dead, but his niece was still in Caldwell Flats. Vincent did not know if Delia knew about the document. He suspected she did not. He suspected it was hidden somewhere in whatever belongings she had taken from the old house, or that she had unknowingly been living with the evidence of Briggs's crimes tucked into some corner of her daily life. He had been trying for months to find a way to approach her about it that would not put her in danger, that would not telegraph to Briggs what he was doing. And now, she was standing in the middle of Main Street with a travel trunk, announcing to the entire population of Caldwell Flats that she was leaving, which meant she was about to take the only evidence that could end Harlan Briggs straight out of the territory. So when the door of the sheriff's office swung open and Vincent Irons said over my watch, he was not, in the strictest legal or personal sense, telling Delia Harmon that she could not leave. He was saying it because he knew Briggs had men watching the road out of town. He was saying it because if Delia left with that document, Briggs's men would stop her before she reached the county line. He was saying it because the fastest way to keep her alive in the next 10 minutes was to make sure that both she and Briggs understood that she was under the direct protection of the law. He was also, and he could not fully explain this even to himself, saying it because the idea of her leaving had produced a sensation in his chest that had nothing to do with evidence or land fraud or federal marshals. Delia Harmon looked at him from across the street with her eyes sharp and her chin up and said, "Excuse me." Vincent stepped off the boardwalk. He crossed Main Street with a walk that was unhurried but deliberate, the kind of walk that took up its own space without needing to announce itself, and he stopped 3 feet in front of her and said, quietly enough that only she could hear it clearly. "I need you to come inside my office. Right now, please." "I am not going anywhere inside," Delia said. "I have a stage to catch." "The Wichita stage doesn't leave until 2 o'clock, Vincent said. "It is 8:40 in the morning. You have time, and I need 10 minutes. "I do not owe you 10 minutes, Delia said. "I do not owe this town 10 minutes. "No," Vincent said. "You don't. But I may owe you a great deal more than that, and I would like the chance to explain it." Something in the way he said it stopped her. Not the words exactly, but the quality behind them. He was not performing authority. He was not using his badge as leverage. He sounded, she thought, like a man who was trying to tell the truth and was not certain he had all the right words for it. The crowd on both sides of Main Street was watching with undisguised fascination. 5 minutes, Delia said. She left her trunk on the street. She followed him into the sheriff's office. The office was small and sparsely furnished, the way a room looks when it belongs to someone who has never expected to stay. A desk, 2 chairs, a gun rack, a wood stove that was not lit because the morning was not yet cold enough for it. A corkboard on one wall with papers pinned to it. Wanted posters. Maps. One window looking out onto Main Street. Vincent closed the door. He did not go behind his desk. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides and he said, "Did you know your Uncle Gerald kept papers for a man named Carver?" Delia looked at him. "What?" "A surveyor named Thomas Carver. He worked for Harlan Briggs for 2 years before he left the territory. Before he left, he gave your uncle something to keep. Documents. I believe those documents are among your uncle's belongings, which I believe are now among your belongings." The air in the room had changed. Delia felt it. "What kind of documents?" "Survey records that were altered," Vincent said. "Claims that were falsified. Evidence that Briggs has been running a land fraud operation that has cost dozens of families everything they had." He paused. "Evidence that could put Harlan Briggs in a federal penitentiary." Delia stood very still. "You think I have this?" "I think you might have it without knowing you have it. And you have known this for how long?" He met her eyes and did not look away. 11 months. The number sat between them like a live thing. "You have known for 11 months, Delia said slowly, "that I might be in possession of something that implicates the most powerful man in this county." "Yes. And you said nothing to me." "I was trying to protect you," Vincent said. "If Briggs knew I suspected it existed, and if he connected it to you, you would have been in danger. The only way to keep you safe was to keep the connection quiet while I built the rest of the case." Delia turned away from him. She walked to the window. Below on Main Street, the crowd had dispersed, gone back to their shops and their days, though she could see her trunk still sitting in the dust where she had left it. She looked at it for a long moment. "Harlan Briggs has been destroying my livelihood for 2 years, she said. Her voice was very even. Too even, the way a voice gets when emotion has been compressed into something dense and controlled. "He has frightened women away from my shop. He has quietly blacklisted me in this town. I have spent 2 years trying to understand what I did wrong, wondering if I was imagining it, telling myself I was not imagining it, and then feeling guilty for not imagining it." She turned back to face Vincent. "And the whole time, the reason was not just that I refused him. The reason was that he thought I had something that could destroy him." "That's what I believe," Vincent said. "He was not punishing me for refusing to marry him," Delia said. "He was containing a potential threat. He was keeping me poor and isolated so that I would either leave or become dependent enough on the town's goodwill that I would never dare to act against him." "Yes." Delia let out a breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "He underestimated me." "He did," Vincent said. And for the first time, something shifted in his face. not the controlled, careful expression of a lawman managing a situation, something warmer and more unguarded. Most people do. She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" Vincent went to his desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer and took out the file, which was thick with papers and maps and affidavits written in careful, plain handwriting. He set it on the desk in front of her. "I need to know if there's anything in your belongings that looks like survey documents. Maps with technical notations, papers with land coordinates, anything you might have taken from your uncle's house without knowing what it was," Delia thought. She thought about the boxes she had packed, about the items she had moved from the rented house to the rooms above the dress shop, about the things she had kept not because they were valuable, but because they were there, the detritus of her uncle's careless life. "His surveying tools," she said slowly. "Gerald had surveying tools. I thought they were from before, from when he was younger. I kept them because they seemed worth keeping. There was a leather satchel with them." "That satchel," Vincent said. "What's in it?" "I haven't opened it in 2 years, Delia said. "It's at the shop, in the storage room at the back." Vincent picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Will you show me?" "Yes," Delia said, "but first I want to understand something. When you stepped out onto that boardwalk this morning and said what you said, were you saying it to protect your evidence, or were you saying it to protect me?" The question landed in the middle of the room with surprising weight. Vincent held her gaze. "Both," he said. "And I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Delia nodded. She was not sure what to do with that answer, but she decided that it was the truth, and that the truth was enough to work with for now. They left the office together. They walked down Front Street with Delia's trunk, which Vincent carried without being asked, to the dress shop on the corner of Front and Second. Pauline, the girl who helped with the sewing, was already there, opening the shutters, and she watched the sheriff carry her employer's trunk up the steps with wide eyes and no comment, because she was very young and knew when adults were doing something that required silence. The storage room at the back of the shop was narrow and smelled of fabric and cedar. There were boxes stacked against one wall, dress forms in the corner, bolts of cloth on shelves. Near the back, on the bottom shelf, was a leather satchel with a brass buckle gone green with age. Delia lifted it out. She set it on the work table in the center of the room and unbuckled the clasp. Inside were a compass, a folding ruler, a small brass level, and 3 bundles of papers folded into thirds and bound with string. The papers were covered in a close, meticulous handwriting, dense with numbers and coordinate notations and small hand-drawn maps with labels that meant nothing to Delia, but that meant everything to Vincent Irons, who stood very still as he leafed through the first bundle with the focused attention of a man reading the most important document of his professional life. "This is it," he said quietly. "That's the evidence," Delia said. "This is the evidence," Vincent said. He looked up at her. "Delia, this is the document that's going to end Harlan Briggs." The sound of her given name in his mouth was unexpected. He had always called her Miss Harmon in the brief and practical exchanges they had shared. The shift was small, but she felt it. "All right," she said. "What happens now?" "I sent a wire to the federal marshal in Wichita today," Vincent said. "I have been in contact with Marshal Connell for 18 months. He has been waiting for this piece. Once I wire him with confirmation that the Carver documents exist and are in my custody, he will be here within the week." He carefully refastened the string around the first bundle. "But I need to ask something of you that is not entirely fair." "Ask it." "I need you not to leave," Vincent said. "Not yet. I may need you as a witness to attest to where these documents were found and in whose possession. If you leave the territory before Connell arrives, Briggs's lawyers will argue the chain of custody." Delia looked at the satchel. She looked at the storage room around her, the shop she had built, the evidence of her own stubborn survival stacked on shelves and pinned to forms. She looked at Vincent Irons, who was holding Thomas Carver's documents with the particular care of a man who understood the weight of what was in his hands. "You are asking me to stay in a town that has spent 2 years trying to drive me out," she said. "Yes. For a town that might not deserve it. For the 30 families that Briggs defrauded," Vincent said. "For the homesteaders who lost their claims. For the people who have been living under his thumb and don't know why things never quite work out." He paused. "Not for the town, for them." Delia was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Pauline moving around in the front of the shop, the soft sound of fabric being folded. "1 week," Delia said. "1 week," Vincent agreed. He took the Carver documents with him. He sent the wire to Marshal Connell that afternoon. And then he did something that he had not planned and could not entirely explain, which was that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after the office work was done, and the town was settling into the long gold hour before supper, he walked down to the dress shop on the corner and knocked on the door. Pauline answered. She called over her shoulder and then stood aside, and Delia came to the door with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a thread caught in her hair, and she looked at him with an expression that was not quite welcoming and not quite dismissive, which he was beginning to understand was her natural operating mode with the world. "I wanted to know if you needed anything," he said. "If there was anything I should know about regarding your safety." "You came to check on me," Delia said. "I came to check on you." "Well," she said. She leaned against the door frame. "I am still here as a grade." "I noticed," Vincent said. He looked out at the street for a moment and then back at her. "I also wanted to say something that I should have said a long time ago. I am sorry for knowing what I knew and saying nothing to you. You deserve to know why things were happening the way they were, and I was so focused on protecting the case that I did not protect you." Delia looked at him steadily. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the street, turning the dust gold and the shadows long, and she thought that he looked very tired in the way that men look when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and are only now beginning to consider setting it down. "That is a more honest apology than I expected," she said. "I mean it honestly," he said. "All right," she said. "Come back tomorrow and I will try to remember what it feels like to trust someone in this town." He came back the next day, and the day after that. The week that Marshal Connell would take to arrive turned out to be more complicated than either of them had planned, because on the 3rd day, Harlan Briggs came to see Vincent. It was not a threat. Briggs was too careful for direct threats. He came into the sheriff's office in the middle of the afternoon, sat down in the chair across from Vincent's desk without being invited, and talked about the weather and the cattle prices and the upcoming county elections for a full 15 minutes before saying, very casually, that he had heard the Harmon woman was still in town. "She is," Vincent said. "I thought she was leaving," Briggs said. "Change of plans," Vincent said. Briggs looked at him with those heavy-lidded eyes that were never quite as sleepy as they appeared. "Interesting," he said. "I hope she's not causing any trouble." "She's a seamstress," Vincent said. "She's mending things." Briggs smiled at that, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "good to know you're keeping an eye on things. That's what a good sheriff does." He stood up, set his hat on his head, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "I'll be honest with you, Irons. That woman has a dark past in this town. Her uncle was a thief and a drunk and left a lot of debts behind him. Some of that unpleasantness has a way of attaching itself to the people who were close to it. I'd be careful about the company I kept if I were you." He left. The door swung shut behind him. Vincent sat for a moment very still. Then he stood up, put on his hat, and went to find Delia. He found her at Agnes Foyle's house, where she had been invited for supper, and he did not interrupt the meal but waited on the front porch until Agnes's door opened, and Delia came out into the early evening, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "Briggs came to see me," Vincent said. Delia went still. "He knows you're still here," Vincent said. "He doesn't know about the documents yet, but he's watching. I want you to know that." "I have been aware of being watched by Harlan Briggs for 2 years," Delia said. "It does not get more comfortable with the telling." "No," Vincent said. "I imagine not." He looked at her. "How are you?" It was such a simple question that she almost did not answer it. People did not ask her that, not in this town, not with any real interest. "I am frightened," she said, as if the admission surprised her. "Not of Briggs exactly. More of the feeling that I have been living inside someone else's plan for a very long time without knowing it, and I am not certain I know how to live outside of that." "That makes sense," Vincent said. "It does not feel like it should," she said. They stood on Agnes Foyle's porch in the early dark, and for the first time they were not talking about evidence or logistics or the law. They were just two people standing close enough to feel the warmth of the other, in the cooling night air of late September on the Kansas prairie. "When this is over," Vincent said, "what will you do?" "I still have the cousin in Denver," Delia said. "That option has not closed." "No," he said. "Of course not." She looked at him. "Do you have a reason other than the case why that option concerns you?" The question was direct, the way all of her questions were, stripped of the polite circumlocutions that most people used to avoid saying what they meant. He had noticed that about her from the first time they had talked. She did not go around things. "I might," he said. "Then I would rather you said it plainly," she said. "I have had enough of people circling around what they actually mean." "All right," Vincent said. He looked at her steadily. "I find that when I imagine you leaving this town, something inside me objects to it very strongly, and it is not about the case. The case is almost closed. What objects is something else entirely." Delia was quiet for a moment. "You have a strange way of expressing that," she said. "I am out of practice," he said. "What happened to your practice?" she asked, and the question was lighter now, the sharpness softened by something that was the beginning of warmth. "There was a woman in Texas," he said, "a long time ago. She chose someone else, which was her right and probably the correct decision, and I came north and I became the kind of man who focuses on his work." "A safe choice," Delia said. "A coward's choice," he said, and she looked at him sharply because that was not what she had expected him to say. "You are not a coward," she said. "Not with other things," he said. "With this I might be." "Well," Delia said, pulling her shawl tighter, "I suppose we both have some practice to catch up on." And she went back inside, and Vincent walked back through the dark to his office, and he sat at his desk for an hour thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Marshal Connell arrived on the 8th day. He came on the noon stage, a spare, businesslike man of 45 with a marshal's badge, and the lean, weathered look of someone who had spent 20 years in the territories. His name was Thomas Connell, and he shook Vincent's hand with the grip of a man who was in a hurry but was too professional to show it. They spent 4 hours in the sheriff's office with the Carver documents spread across the desk. Connell read everything. He asked precise questions. He made notes in a small leather-bound book. He requested to speak with Delia. Delia came to the office that afternoon in her better dress, the dark green wool one she had made herself, and she answered Connell's questions with the same clear directness she brought to everything. She described the satchel, her uncle's belongings, the circumstances under which she had taken possession of them. She described what she knew of Thomas Carver, which was very little, but enough to confirm the connection. She was calm and composed, and only Vincent, who had spent a week learning to read the finer gradations of her expressions, could tell that her hands were not entirely steady. When Connell was satisfied, he told them his plan. He would send for a federal warrant. It would take 3 days. On the day of the arrest, he needed both Vincent and Delia to be present and accounted for, because he expected Briggs to resist, and he expected Briggs's men to create complications, and he wanted no loose ends that could become problems in court. "What about the threat to Miss Harmon?" Vincent asked. He said it before he had decided to say it, and Connell looked at him with the particular attention of a man who is also paying attention to the thing underneath the question. "She'll be safe as long as she stays close to your office," Connell said. He paused. "And as long as nobody talks." "Nobody will talk," Vincent said. Connell looked at him again. "See that they don't," he said. Over the 3 days that followed, a strange and fragile thing happened between Vincent Irons and Delia Harmon. Not strange because it was unexpected, but strange because it happened so naturally, in the middle of a situation that should have left no room for it, that neither of them could have predicted the ease of it. He brought her supper on the second evening, having decided that her safety required her to avoid the public dining room at the hotel. He brought 2 plates from the cafe, covered with cloth, and they ate at her work table in the back of the dress shop, surrounded by bolts of fabric and the tools of her trade, and they talked. Not about Briggs, not about the case. About Missouri, where she had grown up, and about Texas, where he had grown up, and about the particular quality of the sky on the frontier that you either loved or could not bear. She had decided she loved it. He had decided the same thing long ago. They agreed that this was significant, in the way that people begin to find significance in agreements when they are moving toward each other. She told him about her parents, the school teacher and the seamstress, who had been deeply in love and quietly happy until her father had died of a fever when she was 18, and about how her mother had followed him within 2 years from grief as much as any physical cause, and about how she had managed what came after with her uncle because there was nobody else, and because she was the kind of person who managed things. He told her about growing up in a ranch family in South Texas, about being the youngest of 3 brothers, about how he had become a lawman almost by accident, having ridden with a Texas Ranger on a cattle rustler case at 19, and discovering that the work suited him in a way that ranching never had. He told her about moving through different towns and different counties, always temporary, always moving on until Caldwell Flats, where for the first time he had felt the pull of staying. "Why here?" she asked. He looked across the work table at her. The lamp between them made everything amber and close. "I've been asking myself that same question," he said. "I think I know the answer now, but I did not know it when I arrived." She held his gaze. "And what is the answer?" "Something worth staying for," he said. It was the closest either of them had come to saying the thing directly, and she looked at him for a moment and then looked away, but she was not displeased. He could see that. He was learning to read her the way you learn to read a landscape you intend to live in, the particular meaning of each shift in light and shadow. The warrant arrived on the 3rd day. The arrest of Harlan Briggs was, in the practical mechanics of it, not as dramatic as 3 months of building tension might have suggested. Connell was efficient. He brought 2 deputies from Wichita who arrived quietly on the morning stage. Vincent provided the local authority. They went to Briggs's house, which was the largest house in the county, a red brick 2-story on the hill above town that had always seemed to look down on Caldwell Flats rather than be part of it. Briggs came to the door himself. He was a man of considerable composure, and when he saw Connell and the badge and the warrant, he did not shout or reach for anything or run. He looked at Vincent with an expression that was mostly contempt and said, "I should have known you were trouble from the day you rode in." "The warrant is for land fraud," Connell said, "in the matter of the falsification of homestead surveys in Harper, Sumner, and Comanche counties between 1877 and 1882. You are under federal arrest, Mr. Briggs." They put handcuffs on him on his own front porch in the October sunlight. Two of his men who had been watching from the stable made a brief, incomplete move toward intervention, but they stopped when they saw the deputies and thought better of it, and that was really all the violence there was. It was not the dramatic confrontation that the town would later retell. It was a quiet, legal, systematic dismantling of a man's hidden empire, carried out with all the formality and precision that the law could bring. What was more dramatic was what happened afterward. Connell took Briggs and his men to Wichita that afternoon. Before he left, he shook Vincent's hand again and handed him a copy of the federal documentation, and said that he would need Vincent to ride to Wichita in a month for the formal proceedings. He also said, in that same spare, professional tone, that the case was solid, that Thomas Carver's documents were exactly what they needed, and that Harlan Briggs was going to spend a very long time reflecting on his hidden motives in a federal prison. Then he tipped his hat to Delia and got on the stage and was gone. The town of Caldwell Flats stood on Main Street and watched the stage leave, and then they turned and looked at Delia Harmon. What happened in that moment was something that Delia would carry with her for the rest of her life, because it was one of the moments where you see what people are actually made of when the structure they have been hiding behind is suddenly removed. The women who had quietly stopped bringing their sewing to her, whose husbands had done business with Briggs, looked at her now with expressions that were complex and uncomfortable, and that contained, in several cases, something that was the beginning of shame. Agnes Foyle pushed through the crowd and took both of Delia's hands in hers and said nothing, just held them, and that was enough. An older man named Carpenter, who ran the feed store and who had never been either particularly kind or unkind, cleared his throat and said, "Seems like apologies might be in order all around." It was not an eloquent moment, but it was honest. Delia stood in the street and looked at the people of Caldwell Flats and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was not standing outside of something but inside it, and that the feeling was complicated and not entirely comfortable and possibly the beginning of something she had not expected. She turned and found Vincent standing nearby, close enough that she could have reached for him, which she did not do because she was still Delia Harmon and she did not do things she had not considered first. "How do you feel?" he said. "Strange," she said. "I thought I would feel triumph." "I feel something more like grief, for the time that was wasted, for the person I might have been here if things had been different." "You might still be that person," he said. She looked at him. "Is that an argument for staying?" "It might be," he said. "It is not a very good argument," she said. "I know," he said. "I am working on a better one." She was almost smiling. He could see it in the corner of her mouth, the thing that was trying to become a smile but had not quite decided it was safe yet. He understood that. He felt the same thing. Over the following weeks, Caldwell Flats reorganized itself. It was not a comfortable process. The revelation of Briggs's fraud had implications for a significant number of the town's commercial relationships, and there were legal complications and financial uncertainties, and a great deal of difficult conversation. Vincent was busy. Delia was busy, but they found time. He came to the shop in the evenings with a book once, because she had mentioned in passing that she rarely had time to read. And she had looked at the book and then at him, and taken it without comment, and returned it 3 days later with the pages read and her thoughts on every chapter, delivered with an efficiency that made him laugh, which surprised them both because he was not a man who laughed frequently, and she was not a woman who expected to cause it. She came to his office one morning with a coat that she had repaired, 2 buttons replaced, and a tear along the left side, seam that had been mended so cleanly it was invisible. She held it out to him, and he asked what he owed her, and she said nothing, and he said he did not accept things for nothing, and she said that was not what it was. It was something else entirely, and they stood on opposite sides of his desk arguing about the nature of it until Vincent said, "It feels like a gift," and Delia said, "Yes, that is what it is," and looked away first, which was not something she did often. He asked her to walk with him that Sunday, because the Sunday walk was a thing that people in Caldwell Flats did, families and pairs of them, along the track that ran beside the creek east of town. He asked with a formality that was slightly awkward because he was out of practice, as he had said, and she accepted with a directness that hit her nerves, because she was also, underneath the directness, not entirely steady. They walked along the creek in the mid-October light. The cottonwoods had gone yellow. The water was low and clear over the limestone bed. A red-tailed hawk was circling somewhere above the line of hills to the east, and the sky was that particular frontier blue that you either loved or could not bear, and they had agreed that they both loved it. They talked about everything and nothing, about the federal proceedings in Wichita, which Vincent would need to attend in November, about the families who had filed claims to have their homestead surveys reviewed and corrected, which was a slow process but one that was moving, about the shop, which had been busier in the past 2 weeks than in the previous year, as if the women of the town had decided collectively that the best form of apology was commerce. And then, at the point where the creek bent and the cottonwoods grew thick enough to make a kind of private green shade, even in October with half the leaves on the ground, Delia stopped walking and turned to face him. "I need to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been thinking about what you said," she said. "About something worth staying for. I have been thinking about it more than I expected to, and more than I am entirely comfortable with." "I have been thinking about it too," he said. "When I arrived in Caldwell Flats," she said, "I was 24 and I was alone, and I was determined to be fine on my own terms because that was what was available to me. I became very good at that, at being fine on my own terms. It became a habit, and habits are difficult to examine." "Yes," he said. "What I am saying," Delia said, with the precision of a woman who has been composing this statement for several days, "is that I think I have been using independence as a wall, which is not the same thing as actually being independent, and I think I am tired of it." Vincent was quiet for a moment. The hawk had come lower, a dark shape against the blue, circling on a thermal above the creek. "I know what that's like," he said. "Using work as a wall, it amounts to the same thing." "Yes," she said. They looked at each other in the cottonwood shade, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks, that had been present in every supper and every argument about buttons and every walk across Main Street, was finally acknowledged between them, present and real, and no longer deniable. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, with the same quiet deliberateness with which he did most things. She looked down at their hands and then back up at him, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, the careful composure she wore like armor genuinely set aside. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." "I will allow it," she said. And then, because she was Delia Harmon, she added, "You should know that I am not an easy woman to court. I have opinions and I am not shy about them, and I do not intend to change." "I know that," he said. "It is among the things I most respect about you." She looked at him steadily. "You mean that?" "I do." "All right then," she said. She gave his hand a brief, firm pressure before she let it go. "Properly, you said." "Properly," he confirmed. She nodded. "Good. Because I am not a woman to be rushed." He smiled at that. It was not a performance. It was just a man in the October light, genuinely smiling at the woman beside him. And it changed his face in a way that she filed away and returned to. In the private inventory she kept of things she was not ready to name yet. The November proceedings in Wichita were everything that Connell had promised. The federal case against Harlan Briggs moved with a certainty that reflected the quality of the evidence. Thomas Carver's documents confirming what the surveyor's maps and the county records had already suggested. Briggs entered a courtroom with his lawyers and his certainty, and emerged 2 days later without either. The verdict was guilty on 7 counts of land fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. The sentence was 18 years in a federal penitentiary. Vincent sent a telegram to Delia from Wichita that said, "Verdict in. Guilty on all counts. Coming home tomorrow." Coming home, he had written. He noticed it as he sent it, the word that had come naturally before he could choose a different one. Delia read the telegram in the dress shop on a Tuesday morning with Pauline watching from the corner, and she read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in her pocket. And when Pauline asked what it said, she replied, "Justice, apparently," which was accurate and also not the whole truth. He arrived back in Caldwell Flats on a Wednesday afternoon in November, when the sky was low and gray, and the first real cold of the season had arrived overnight, turning the mud on Main Street into something between liquid and solid. He stepped off the stage, and she was not waiting for him because she had not known the exact time of his return. But he had been in his office for perhaps 40 minutes when she knocked on the door. She came in with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe, because it was cold and because she had happened to be walking past, which was entirely true and also not the whole story. She set 1 cup on his desk. She sat in the chair across from him. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her over the steam. "How does it feel?" she said. "Like something that needed doing is done," he said, "and like other things are waiting to begin." She looked at him. "That is the better argument," she said. "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." November moved into December, and December brought snow to the Kansas prairie, early and serious, the kind of snow that settles in and intends to stay. The town changed shape under it, going quieter and closer. Fires burned in every hearth. The dress shop was warm with the heat of the stove and the busyness of the Christmas season. Women coming in for alterations and new pieces. The commerce of reconciliation that Delia had come to accept for what it was worth. Vincent came for supper twice a week. They had arrived at this rhythm without formally deciding on it, the way the most natural things establish themselves. And Delia had accepted it, and found that she did not resent the rhythm the way she would have expected to, the way she had always slightly resented the intrusions of other people's expectations on her time. His presence in her kitchen on Tuesday and Thursday evenings was not an intrusion. It was something she noticed the absence of on other evenings. One Tuesday in December, 3 days before Christmas, they were sitting at her table after supper with the stove going and the snow visible through the window, the town outside quiet and muffled under its white covering, and Vincent said, without preamble, "I want to marry you." Delia set down her coffee cup. She looked at him. "That is not a question," she said. "Not exactly," he said, "but I am trying to lead up to one, and I found I could not get to it without saying that first." "Go on," she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had a way of landing on a person like they intended to stay. "I have never been entirely comfortable with elaborate speeches," he said. "I'm better with plain speaking. So plainly, I love you." I have been in love with you for longer than I was prepared to admit, and I want to build something with you, something permanent. I want to be the person who is beside you for the rest of your life. I want to marry you, and I would like to know if you will have me." The room was very quiet. The snow outside made the silence deeper. "You are asking me now," she said, "in my kitchen, on a Tuesday." "Yes," he said. "I know it is not romantic in the conventional sense." "No," she said. "It is actually the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, because it is completely honest and entirely you." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Something in his face changed with an immediacy that she understood was not performance. It was relief and happiness, and the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a weight and has just been given permission to set it down. He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his. "I should tell you," she said, "I am not going to become a different kind of person because I am married. I am still going to have opinions." "I know," he said, "and I am keeping the shop." "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise," he said. "Good," she said, and she was smiling now fully with nothing held back. They were married in February of 1883, in the small church on 2nd Street, on a Saturday when the sky was clear, and the temperature was 10 degrees below what anyone would have called comfortable. And the church was full of people who came with the genuine warmth of a community that had been through something difficult and come out changed on the other side. Agnes Foyle sat in the front pew. Pauline cried during the vows, which she would later deny. The old man carpenter stood in the back and looked at his boots when anyone looked at him, which Delia understood was his version of attending emotionally. Vincent stood at the front of the church and watched Delia come down the aisle in the cream-colored dress she had made herself, which fit her with the precision that only the person who made it could achieve. And his expression was so unguarded in that moment that Agnes Foyle, who had known him for 3 years and always considered him a closed book, had to look away briefly because it felt like witnessing something private. The vows they exchanged were the standard ones, but they meant them in the specific, precise way that people mean things when they have arrived at them through difficulty, rather than ease. Vincent said love and honor, and in the framework of 1883 he also said cherish, and he meant it without reservation. Delia said the same words back with a steadiness in her voice that did not waver once, and that was its own kind of declaration. The reception was in the town hall. There was fiddle music and food that half the town had contributed. There was dancing, which Vincent was not skilled at and Delia was, and she taught him the steps with the same patient directness she brought to everything, her hand in his, saying, "Again and again you have it," until he did roughly have it, and they danced together while the fiddles played and the wood stove in the corner threw its orange light across the faces of the people of Caldwell Flats. Late in the evening, when the dancing had slowed and people were beginning to drift toward their coats, Vincent and Delia stood together near the window of the town hall and looked out at the February night, the street white and still, the stars extraordinary above it. "Are you glad you stayed?" he asked. She turned to look at him, her new husband, this man who had stood on a boardwalk in September and said 3 words that had changed everything. "Ask me in 20 years, she said. "I intend to," he said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the fiddle played one more song for the stragglers, low and sweet. And the night was very deep, and the stars were very far away, and the world was small and warm and entirely enough. They spent their first year of marriage discovering each other in the daily, practical, unglamorous, and profoundly intimate way that married people do. The geography of another person's habits and preferences and moods, the small negotiations of shared space, the particular tenderness of learning someone's silences as well as their speech. Delia kept the shop. She expanded it in the spring of 1883, taking the space next door that had been a harness shop and turning it into a proper dressmaking establishment with 2 fitting rooms and a workbench long enough for 5 people to use at once. She hired 2 more women. She began taking mail orders from women in smaller towns who had heard of her work through the complicated network of frontier communication. She was, by any measure, a businesswoman in a time and place that did not have a formal category for what she was, and she occupied the space anyway with the same quiet, absolute determination with which she had always occupied everything. Vincent ran his office with the same steady, careful precision he brought to all his work. The aftermath of the Briggs case had brought changes to the county's legal structure, new oversight, clearer processes, and his reputation as the man who had brought it down had given him a standing in the community that he used with characteristic restraint, not for personal advantage, but for the practical improvements that a well-run county office could provide. He hired a deputy in the spring, a young man of 22 named Walter Ellis, and he trained him with the kind of patient, demanding mentorship that produced, over time, a genuinely competent lawman. She got pregnant in July of 1883 and told him on a Thursday morning while they were eating breakfast, setting down her coffee cup and saying, "I believe there is going to be a child," with the combination of certainty and careful wonder that characterized her approach to large and important things. Vincent looked up from his plate, and the expression on his face was one she saved in the collection of moments she kept, joining the inventory of things she had come to depend on, his honesty and his steadiness, and the way he laughed in the rare moments he laughed fully. And she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that this was what she had been afraid of, not love itself but the vulnerability of it, the terrifying openness of having something this worth having. He came around the table and took both her hands and said nothing for a moment, just held them and then said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I am very well. I am just also somewhat overwhelmed, which I expect will pass." "It might not," he said. "I am fairly overwhelmed myself." "Is that so?" she said. "It is very much so," he said. Their son was born in March of 1884 in the house on the north end of town, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable and steady woman named Dr. Ruth Carey, who had moved to Caldwell Flats in the fall of 1883, and who Delia had liked from the first day on the grounds that she was professional, and did not explain things to Delia in the simplified way that some people did when they assumed she did not understand. The birth was difficult, long and exhausting in the way that first births often are, and Vincent sat outside the bedroom door for 7 hours in a state of controlled anxiety that Walter Ellis, who had come to check on him at midnight, said was the only time he had ever seen the sheriff look genuinely frightened. The baby was a boy. They named him James, after both of their fathers, who had shared the name by coincidence, which Delia said was not really a coincidence because she did not believe in coincidences on the scale of significance, only on the scale of inconvenience. James Vincent Irons arrived in the world with strong lungs and a frowning expression that the doctor said was entirely normal, and that Vincent said looked extremely familiar. He was small and red and furious in the way of all new people, and Delia held him in the exhausted aftermath of the night and looked at him with an expression that Vincent would later say was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Well," she said to the baby in the early morning light, with the particular directness she brought to all introductions, "I am your mother. We are going to have a great deal to talk about." James grew in the way that children grow on the frontier, with a combination of hardiness and curiosity that kept his parents in a state of engaged alarm. He was walking at 11 months and talking at 13, and by the age of 2, had opinions about everything he encountered, which his mother took as evidence of character, and his father took as evidence that he was going to be a handful. Caldwell Flats itself continued to grow and change through the mid-1880s. The land fraud cases that had followed Briggs's conviction resulted, over 2 years, in the restoration of 17 homestead claims that had been falsified, and 11 families who had been living in a kind of legal uncertainty for years found themselves on firm legal ground for the first time. The town grew a little and changed a little, and the coming of the railroad to a town 20 miles south in 1885 changed the economic pattern of the county in ways that required adjustment. The adjustment was not painless, but it was navigated with the kind of pragmatic community effort that a place can manage when it has been through something harder and learned to work together. Agnes Foyle retired from teaching in 1886 and moved to her daughter's household in Kansas City, and the departure of her oldest friend in Caldwell Flats was something Delia felt as a genuine grief, softened but not eliminated by the regular letters they exchanged, which were long and informative and full of the particular warmth of a friendship that did not require proximity to remain itself. In the summer of 1886, Delia got pregnant again. This time she told Vincent on a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the front porch in the heat of the July afternoon, James asleep inside, the prairie spread out ahead of them in the shimmer of the summer. Vincent turned to look at her, and she saw in his face something that was not just happiness, but the accumulated happiness of the years between, layered and solid and real. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Warm," she said. "And rather pleased, actually." "Good," he said. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he always reached for her hand, with the same quiet deliberateness, as if the gesture itself were a kind of renewal. "James will have opinions about this," Delia said. "He has opinions about everything," Vincent said. "He comes by it honestly," she said. "From both directions," Vincent agreed. Their daughter was born in January of 1887. They named her Alina. She arrived more easily than James had, which the doctor said was common for second children, and she was a quieter baby than James had been, which the doctor also said was common, and which Vincent said was a genuine mercy. She had Delia's dark eyes and Vincent's capacity for observation, and she spent the first several months of her life looking at the world with a focused attention that people commented on, an alertness that seemed to catalog everything it encountered. James, who was 3 years old, approached his sister with the combination of suspicion and tentative interest that 3-year-olds bring to major changes in their domestic arrangements. He stood at the edge of Delia's bed on the day Alina came home and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "She is very small." "You were very small once," Delia said. "I do not remember that," James said, which was technically true and also seemed to serve as his final word on the subject. Within a month, he had appointed himself her guardian in a way that expressed itself as standing between her and anything he considered a threat, which at that stage of her life included dogs, strangers, loud noises, and on one notable occasion, a very large hat belonging to a woman who had come to the shop for alterations. The years moved through the decade with the accumulation of days that make up a life, the texture of the ordinary and the occasional punctuation of the extraordinary. Vincent was re-elected sheriff in 1884 and again in 1888. Delia's business continued to grow, and by 1887 she had opened a second, smaller operation in the town of Meade, 40 miles southwest, managed by a woman she had trained herself, and the success of it was something she took quiet pride in, the specific pride of having built something with her own intelligence and labor. They argued, occasionally, about the things that couples with strong views argue about: money and time and the proper approach to raising children. And they always came back to each other with the same basic respect that had been there from the beginning, that had been in the way he had looked at her when she was standing on Main Street with her trunk and her defiance, before he even knew her, something in him already recognizing something in her that he did not have a word for yet. One evening in October of 1888, which was the autumn of their 5th year of marriage, they were sitting on the front porch after the children were in bed, and the night was very clear in the way of fall nights on the Kansas prairie, the stars beginning to show in the east. Vincent had his coffee and Delia had her shawl, and neither of them was saying anything because they had arrived at the comfortable particular to long intimacy, where silence is not absence but its own kind of conversation. "Are you glad you stayed?" he asked. The same question he had asked on their wedding night, delivered with the same quiet intentionality. Delia turned to look at him. Her husband, the father of her children. The man who had said 3 words on a September morning that had interrupted her departure and changed the direction of everything. "I was always glad," she said. "I did not want to admit it right away." "Why not?" he said. "Because I am stubborn," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is one of your finest qualities." She gave him a look that he met with an expression of complete equanimity. And then she laughed, and the laugh was the real one, the one without any armor in it, and the sound of it moved out into the October night and was absorbed by the immensity of the prairie around them. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and above them the stars were extraordinary, and the world was exactly the right size. Down the street, Walter Ellis was making his evening round of the town, his footsteps unhurried in the quiet. In the school, a new teacher was preparing lessons for tomorrow's class, in which James Irons would ask 3 questions that derailed the morning's plan, and Alina Irons would sit in the second row watching everything with her cataloging attention. In the dress shop on the corner of Front and Second, 2 half-finished dresses hung on their forms, waiting for tomorrow's work. In the house on the north end of town, the 2 children slept with the absolute confidence of children who have been given no reason to doubt that the morning will come. In Wichita, Harlan Briggs was in the 3rd year of an 18-year sentence, and the 30 families whose claims had been restored were farming their land and building their lives. And Thomas Carver, wherever he was, had left something behind that had mattered more than he could have known. And on the porch, in the October dark, Delia Harmon Irons and Vincent Irons sat together and were exactly where they were, which was to say they were home, which was to say they were beside each other, which was to say that the journey from a travel trunk in the dust of Main Street to this porch, this night, this life, had been the most important and the most surprising and the most true thing that either of them had ever done. The town had heard her say she was leaving. The sheriff had stood up and said over my watch. Neither of them had known in that moment what those 3 words were really promising. The stars came out one by one above the Kansas prairie. The night was cool and still. Somewhere near the creek east of town, a coyote called once and was answered. The town of Caldwell Flats settled into its evening quiet. And Vincent Irons pressed his lips to the top of Delia's head, and she folded her hands around her coffee cup and closed her eyes, and the world was very good.